Hi everybody, welcome to IS 310, Unit 1, Topic 2. Today we're talking about the shift from general IGO commitment, where folks were looking at intergovernmental organizations related to specific topics they were interested in trying to better themselves in and through. In other words, the Postal Union we looked at, the Telegraph, which now becomes the Telecommunications Union, is the second one. There were things like how to govern access to transnational rivers, not just how much water you would share, but who would get access to, say, the Rhine River or the Danube or something like that in Europe. Lots of these sort of specific looks, but there becomes a point in the late 1800s, early 20th century where the shift comes to look at a general, broad IGO that encompasses lots of different things. I won't talk too much about the League of Nations, and the reason is that a longer term conversation about the League focuses on its failures. What I'm most interested in is what about it the rest of the world liked and why they want to try again. That after it failed, and the League does fail, so hopefully you knew that. If you didn't, I've just blown the whole exciting story for you. But it does fail. But they turn around at the end of World War II and try again with the United Nations. And I'm more interested in why that is than why it failed. So let's look first now at what we did with the IGO experiment. By the end of the 20th century, the 19th century, sorry, by the end of the 1800s, they're looking at some different concepts to address. And in 1899 began to have something called the Hague Conventions, which lead to the Geneva Conventions. And these are things that are really quite interesting because they're talking about governing war and peace. The goal is peace, but the secondary goal is appropriate warfare. So they begin to talk about limiting their ability to fight war the way they might want to fight it by having a series of agreements that looks at, for example, what does it mean to drop bombs out of balloons at the time? It wasn't airplanes yet. What does it mean to have canisters of gas? What does it mean if you catch a deserter or a spy? Or what are prisoners of war? What kind of rights do they have? We begin to talk about these things very early. And actually, one of the very interesting venues for conversations about sovereignty and benefits is war and peace. And to me, that's one of the most interesting things out there because in war, you're talking about a situation where countries are looking to conquer or defend themselves, conquer others, defend themselves, and you would think that they would be interested in using whatever means possible. Certainly, that's basically the way that European warfare certainly was combated before that. But they begin to limit themselves and say, no, we won't treat prisoners this way. We will treat pirates this way. We will avoid the use of certain kinds of weaponry, and it's a very interesting thing. So what they come up with, though, in 1899 is the Hague Convention that leads to something called the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Its symbol is there on the right. The place where it meets is there on the bottom. It's a court where countries could take disputes, typically not major disputes that were going to lead to war, but they were things where they both had an idea about how maybe a river bend or a piece of territory or reparations. Let's say somebody in my country was killed by someone in your country. Maybe there was some sort of dickering to do about not just where the person would be tried, if they would be tried, but reparations, businesses from one country to the other, all kinds of things could be decided upon at this court. And it was this decision then that you might not bind yourself to what they find or bind yourself to going. In other words, you could decline to go. It was a situation more where if countries agreed, they could go to the Court of Arbitration. The court could rule for them. This court still exists, by the way. There's still the Court of Arbitration where countries can take disputes. It's different from something called the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, but it's still there. And it still provides that forum. So the IGO experiment began to, what I would say, expand. If you're going to start talking about war and peace and limiting yourself in warfare and suggesting that you might find a different way forward instead of conflict or war or aggression, you'd use a court of arbitration, then you're prepared to talk about different sorts of things. And that comes to fruition at the end of World War I. So World War I is a nasty, nasty thing. At the time, obviously, it wasn't called World War I. It's the Great War. It involves all these powers, and we won't get into exactly why it happened, except for how it pertains to these 14 points. So we want to look at the end of the war. So like the end of World War II, the end of World War I is not the first time that they're talking about having something like the League of Nations, or the General Association of Nations, or what peace should look like. Certainly, as you'll see with the UN, it's in 1945 that the UN is formed, but it's the middle of the war when they're talking about what they want to do next. And in World War I, the main actor in trying to determine what should be done next was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson, he basically looked at uh, what he believed caused the war. And he made a list of things that he suggested everyone should agree to, and if they agreed to it, there would be a less likelihood of war. And then he suggested that there should be a General Association of Nations, an IGO, where countries could get together and talk and debate and discuss and try and make decisions on what should be done next. So the first 13 of his 14 points are an attempt to avoid having the same thing happen in the future. So he said, look, these agreements, secret agreements, help lead to World War One, or the spreading of World War One. That there are a series of treaties that have been entered into by countries where one promised to help another, and in a whole series of these, you had a conflict between two countries that soon became a conflict between many because they had agreed to do so by secret treaty. And his point was, if that had been known, if you knew that one country would come to the aid of another, if the first was attacked, then it would be a deterrent. An open agreement, openly arrived at, would prevent that. It's one of the points to having NATO today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's one of those IGOs that is a common defense treaty for the member states. It says very clearly that if one member state is attacked, the others will come to its defense. It's a binding mandatory clause in there. He believed that the openness would help. He believed that freedom of the seas would be helpful. There had been not quite an IGO, but an agreement between several states that tried to determine before World War I who got how much tonnage in shipping and naval power at sea, and that frustrated other states who felt like they had to go out and sort of conquer their share. And he said, no, it should be free seas, free trade. There should be disarmament. There should be decolonization. That the frustration of Gonzalo Princip and folks like him in Serbia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that if they had the right to self-determination, it would also help relieve the pressures. What basically happened in the Treaty of Versailles, they got rid of these first 13 things, and they just did the 14th. And Wilson's basic perspective was, if he didn't do the other 13, then 14 was doomed to failure. He still believed in 14 and pushed it. The League of Nations itself, which is what comes next, it's founded in 1920. It comes after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The United States ends up not joining it, and for a variety of reasons. But one of the precipitating factors was Woodrow Wilson became quite ill. He became fairly incapacitated and eventually died. He was unable to, he had advocated for his ideas very strongly in Europe, and he had begun to do that in the United States as well, but he was unable to really carry the argument home because he got very sick. You also had a lot of people who were afraid of the trade of sovereignty for the benefits that they believed it would provide, that for the United States at least, because of geographic isolation in particular, would be able to stay out of conflicts if they just decided not to engage at all. Whereas if you engaged and the League said, now we're going to war, that they might have to go to war. So that there was not, the benefit wasn't the same. That you could find the benefit without trading the sovereignty just by staying out. And I'm going to ask you to read a famous speech by William Edgar Bora, Bora of Idaho, a famous U.S. senator, who made the strongest case in the U.S. Senate against joining the League. And a lot of those ideas you can see resonate for other IGOs as well. So the League of Nations, though, did exist from 1920 officially through 1946 when the UN replaced it, but it doesn't operate well most of that time, and certainly by the time you got to World War II, it's a shell of itself. Again, I don't want to focus on why it didn't work, except to say it was hamstrung from the beginning because the United States wasn't a member. They didn't let Germany join as part of the punishment for World War I. The Russians leave after the Russian Revolution. The Japanese leave because the League tries to tell them what to do, and they don't like the League telling them what to do. They had some territorial aggression. It doesn't work out. And some other things are hamstringing it as it goes along. But they liked it. They liked the idea of a forum where everyone had someone posted and they could talk whenever they needed. That forum for just visiting, for just talking, it sounds silly or perhaps basic and banal, but the ability to have official representatives of the executive branch someplace staffed full time, where if an issue comes up, you can just call them on the phone, send a runner, uh, uh, talk to somebody after the meeting, etc., is important. They like the ability to connect with each other. There's also hopes that you can improve it, but the basic conversation is it valuable to have a place where all of our representatives sit in council, either with each other collectively or with each other individually. So you may have a collective meeting, you don't really care, like right now there's 193 member states plus a bunch of observers, maybe you don't care about 185 of them, but maybe tomorrow something happens and suddenly you do. And it's easier to get your representatives to talk to each other there than perhaps somewhere else. So the venue for conversation is important. So by the middle of World War II, even earlier, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has started using the phrase the United Nations of the world to refer to the states that are allied and even neutral vis-a-vis the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. And they're talking about what the world might look like. And so you've got three images here on this screen. The one on the right is of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill meeting in Tehran in Iran, where there was the first time the big three got together and talked. They had lots of other meetings where two or of them, different combinations, and or their ministers got together, but this was the first time when they got together in Tehran in 1943, and they are planning war strategy, but also post-war strategy. So they agree to have a couple of meetings. So one is in a place called Bretton Woods. It's a monetary conference. What are you going to do to rebuild the world when the Allies win? Is the question. And so the United States gets 44 countries together in a place called Bretton Woods oh my gosh, my U.S. geography is really impressive. But I do get New Hampshire and Vermont confused. So it's New Hampshire. Bretton Woods is in New Hampshire. And if I screwed that up, then I have to record the whole lecture over here. We're going to go with New Hampshire, where 44 countries get together to talk about both the kind of International Monetary Fund. How do you make big giant loans to rebuild infrastructure? So that'll become the World Bank. How do you do reconstruction and development? So they form something eventually called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. What do you do about monetary systems? What's the basic rate of exchange? What's the gold standard? What currency do you peg things to? And so they agree to use the dollar. All kinds of things. And that's interesting because if you form that organization, then those states are agreeing to not make international agreements, financial agreements, based in currencies other than the United States. Now, it doesn't prevent them from bilaterally, like saying, "Oh, I'm going to get a loan from the Chinese." The Chinese don't have to loan uh, um, Sierra Leone money in dollars. But if you're going to have the intergovernmental organization, the organization itself loan money out, then it's going to be in dollars. That's agreed upon there. And so all the other states agree. It's an interesting thing. Then they also meet at a place called Bretton Woods, which is a retreat slash old um, house that some folks had in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and agree to organize the United Nations. They agreed to have that conference. So that's basically a handful, a smaller group of individuals, four secretaries of state of the big four powers getting together there to decide that. The result then is the foundation of the United Nations in 1945. So what they basically agreed, Bretton, was they're going to have a meeting called the United Nations Conference on International Organization, at which they're going to debate and discuss what the organization exactly will look like, at least at its beginnings. So that happens in San Francisco, and that's where you get the UN Charter. So we're going to focus on the UN Charter next, but that's where they're going to try and right the wrongs of the League of Nations, and they're going to do it because they like the model of having a place to visit, to discuss, to make sure that the needs of the day are being addressed, and that if something comes up, they're there and ready to go. So, your takeaway. The experiment suggested talking mattered, and what they really are interested in is avoiding a world war. They didn't like World War I, the Great War. They don't like World War II. Who would, right? So what they're going to try and do is set up an organization to help them avoid those. So most of the stuff you're going to see come out of the UN Charter, we'll talk about next week, is how do you avoid that? Some of it goes back to those 14 points that Woodrow Wilson had. Some of it's new, but it's all designed to prevent that. So we'll shift to the UN Charter next. I look forward to talking to you next time.